In 1945, Egyptian farmers unearthed clay jars near Nag Hammadi containing texts buried for 16 centuries. Texts the early church tried desperately to destroy. These Gnostic Gospels spoke of something chilling, that our world is a garden and we are the crop. Thousands of years earlier, Sumerian scribes pressed into wet clay stories of gods called the Anunnaki, beings who fashioned humanity for one purpose: to serve. What connects these ancient warnings? Why did civilizations separated by millennia arrive at the same terrifying conclusion? Tonight, as the world sleeps, we journey through forbidden knowledge, through archons and demiurges, through harvest systems and soul traps, into the deepest question of human existence. Are we truly free? In the stillness between one breath and the next, there exists a space where the rational mind grows quiet and older ways of knowing begin to stir. And it is here in this liminal hour, when the world outside has softened into shadow, that we turn our attention to questions humanity has carried since the very first fires were lit against the darkness of an indifferent night. Across every continent and throughout every age, human beings have gathered under stars and whispered the same troubling suspicion that this world is not quite what it seems, that beneath the surface of ordinary life there moves something vast and ancient and perhaps not entirely benevolent. And these whispers have never been silenced, no matter how many centuries pass or how sophisticated our philosophies become. The Sumerians carved their warnings into wet clay over 4,000 years ago in the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where civilization itself first took root. And remarkably, those clay tablets survived the collapse of empires and the burning of libraries, and the slow, patient erosion of time to speak to us still in our modern age, with messages that scholars have only begun to fully translate and comprehend. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia encoded similar knowledge in their Dreamtime stories, passed down through 40,000 years of unbroken oral tradition, while the Vedic sages of India composed hymns about cosmic cycles of creation and destruction that mirror accounts found in traditions they could never have contacted. And the mystery deepens when we discover that isolated cultures, separated by vast oceans and impassable mountain ranges, somehow arrived at the same disturbing conclusions about the nature of human existence and its ultimate purpose. Tonight, as the noise of the waking world recedes and your thoughts begin their gentle drift towards sleep, we will explore what others have too hastily dismissed, not with the harsh light of skeptical interrogation, but with the softer illumination that comes from genuine curiosity and a willingness to consider that perhaps our ancestors knew something we have forgotten, something important, something that the keepers of orthodox knowledge have always preferred we never remember. The desert wind that once swept across Mesopotamia still blows tonight somewhere on this spinning planet, carrying with it the same sand that buried temples and ziggurats, and the countless tablets upon which scribes recorded the activities of beings they called the Anunnaki, a name that translates roughly to those who from heaven to earth came. And in the cuneiform script pressed into clay, we find not mere mythology, but what appears to be a detailed administrative record of entities who took an uncomfortably direct interest in human affairs. In the ancient city of Nippur, archaeologists unearthed tablets dating to the reign of Gudea, around 2100 BCE, that describe these Anunnaki as the most powerful beings in the Sumerian pantheon, entities who held council in celestial assemblies and whose primary function, according to the texts themselves, was to decree the fates of mankind, not merely to observe or inspire, but to actively determine what humanity would and would not be permitted to become. The Sumerians did not write about their gods the way later peoples would compose devotional literature filled with metaphor and spiritual allegory. Instead, they maintained what can only be described as bureaucratic precision in documenting the activities, habits, preferences, and conflicts of these beings, recording which deity preferred, which offerings at which temple, on which day of which month, noting property disputes between divine estates, cataloguing the construction projects these entities commissioned, and the human labor forces required to complete them. This level of mundane administrative detail strikes the modern reader as deeply strange, because it does not read like religion at all, but rather like the documentation of a colonial occupation, complete with resource extraction quotas and labor management protocols and careful notation of which human settlements fell under the jurisdiction of which supervising entity. And it is this unsettling ordinariness that has led certain researchers to propose interpretations that mainstream academia has firmly rejected, but which nonetheless refuse to disappear from human consideration. Zecharia Sitchin spent decades studying these tablets and published a series of books beginning in 1976 that proposed a radical rereading of the Sumerian record, suggesting that the Anunnaki were not supernatural gods at all, but rather technologically advanced beings from beyond Earth who genetically engineered Homo sapiens from existing hominid stock to serve as a labor force for mining operations. And while professional scholars have dismissed his translations as creative misreadings at best and deliberate fabrications at worst, his ideas have taken root in the popular imagination precisely because they provide a framework for understanding certain troubling aspects of the ancient texts that conventional interpretations struggle to address. The academic consensus holds that Sitchin made numerous translation errors and imposed modern concepts onto ancient material that was never intended to be read literally. And this criticism deserves serious consideration, because the desire to find extraordinary explanations can certainly lead researchers to see patterns that exist only in their own expectations. Yet, even setting aside Sitchin's specific claims, the original Sumerian texts themselves contain elements that require explanation, regardless of which interpretive framework one adopts. The story of human creation found in these tablets describes a time when the lesser gods, called the Igigi, grew weary of the hard labor they were forced to perform and rose up in rebellion against their overseers. And in response to this divine labor dispute, the higher gods convened to solve the problem by creating a new worker species that would take over the burdensome tasks. Mixing the blood of a sacrificed deity with the clay of the earth to fashion the first human beings whose purpose from the very beginning was to serve to dig, to build, and to toil so that the gods might rest. This creation narrative carries implications that later religious traditions would carefully revise and soften, for it suggests that humanity was not fashioned out of love or bestowed with inherent dignity, but rather manufactured to fulfill a specific function in a cosmic economy that valued human beings only for their productive capacity. And the texts further indicate that certain potentials were deliberately withheld from this new creation, that the fullness of divine capability and longevity were intentionally denied to ensure that humans would remain manageable and dependent on workers who would labor and die and be replaced in endless generations without ever accumulating enough knowledge or power to question the arrangement. The garden motif appears in these accounts just as it does in later traditions with which we are more familiar, but here the garden reads less like a paradise freely given and more like a controlled environment designed for optimal cultivation, a space where the crop could be monitored and maintained and prevented from growing beyond its intended boundaries. And when humans in these stories reach for forbidden knowledge or attempt to transcend their assigned limitations, they are invariably punished and return to their proper place in the order of things. Gold appears with remarkable frequency in these ancient accounts as the substance the gods most desired and the primary reason human labor was required. And this peculiar emphasis on a soft metal with limited practical utility has puzzled researchers who note that gold serves no obvious survival purpose for beings advanced enough to traverse the cosmos, yet features prominently in creation narratives from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica to the myths of sub-Saharan Africa, suggesting either a common source for these traditions or a common experience that independently generated the same symbolic associations. The centuries passed, and empires rose and fell, and the clay tablets were buried beneath the sands of time, while new civilizations emerged, carrying fragments of the old knowledge reshaped and reinterpreted through successive cultural filters. And by the time we reach the ferment of religious experimentation in the first centuries of the Common Era, we find these ancient Mesopotamian concepts surfacing again in unexpected forms among communities of spiritual seekers who would come to be known as the Gnostics. The German scholar Wilhelm Ans demonstrated over a century ago that Gnostic beliefs about the soul's journey after death closely parallel Babylonian astrological traditions, describing the ascent through the realms of 7 planetary powers to reach the highest heaven of Anu, suggesting a direct line of transmission from the ziggurats of ancient Sumer to the underground meeting rooms, where Gnostic Christians gathered to share teachings that the emerging Orthodox Church would soon declare heretical and attempt to destroy. Whether this represents the careful preservation of ancient wisdom passed down through mystery schools and initiatic lineages, or the independent rediscovery of perennial truths that the human soul recognizes whenever it turns its attention inward, remains a question each seeker must ultimately answer for themselves. But what cannot be denied is the remarkable continuity of certain core ideas across traditions, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. Ideas about the nature of this world as a place of limitation and forgetting, but about the existence of cosmic powers invested in maintaining human ignorance, and about the possibility of awakening to a truth that renders the entire elaborate prison suddenly transparent and passable. The Gnostics would develop these intimations into a comprehensive mythology of breathtaking scope and disturbing implication. A vision of reality in which the world we see and touch was fashioned not by the ultimate source of all being, but by a lesser and ignorant craftsman who mistook himself for the highest God and who rules his flawed creation through a hierarchy of spiritual powers whose interest in humanity is not benevolent but extractive. And it is to this vision that we now turn as the night deepens and the ancient questions press ever closer to the threshold of our dreaming minds. In the year 1945, In the dry hills near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a peasant farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer in the soft earth near the Jabal al-Tarif cliffs when his mattock struck something hard, and there beneath the soil he discovered a large sealed clay jar, a vessel that had waited in silence for nearly 1,600 years. And when he broke it open hoping to find gold, he instead found something far more valuable, though he did not know it at the time, for inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing 52 separate texts, ancient manuscripts written in Coptic that would come to be known as the Nag Hammadi Library. And among these weathered pages lay documents that the early Christian church had tried desperately to destroy. Texts like the hypostasis of the archons, which translates to the reality of the rulers, originally composed in Greek during the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, and the Apocryphon of John, and the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Philip, and a text called On the Origin of the World, each one offering a radically different vision of creation and salvation than the orthodoxy that had come to dominate Western spirituality. And as scholars slowly translated these fragile pages over the following decades, a picture emerged of an alternative Christianity, a tradition called Gnosticism that had flourished in the early centuries after Christ before being systematically suppressed as heresy. And what made these teachings so dangerous to the established church was their fundamental inversion of everything the Orthodox tradition held sacred. For where traditional Christianity taught that the God of the Old Testament was the supreme creator deserving of worship and obedience, the Gnostics declared that this creator was in fact a blind and ignorant impostor, a being they called the demiurge, whose very name means craftsman or artisan. And according to the Gnostic cosmology, this demiurge was not the true God at all, but rather a cosmic mistake, an accidental offspring of Sophia, the divine feminine principle of wisdom, who in her longing to create without her consort inadvertently brought forth a flawed and ignorant being. And this entity took the form of a creature, part lion and part serpent, in a being of shadow and arrogance, who became known by many names, including Yaldabaoth and Saklas, meaning fool, and Samael, meaning blind god. And in his blindness and his isolation from the true divine realm called the pleroma, or fullness, this demiurge looked out upon the void and declared with absolute conviction that he was the only God, that there was no other God but him. And in that moment of cosmic hubris, a voice rang out from the incorruptible realm above, saying, "You are wrong, Samael. You are wrong, blind God." But Yaldabaoth could not comprehend what he heard, for he lacked the gnosis, the divine knowledge that would have allowed him to recognize his own limitations. And so he set about creating the material universe, this world of matter and suffering that we inhabit, fashioning it not as an act of love, but as an imitation, a crude copy of the divine patterns he could dimly perceive but never truly understand. And to help him govern this flawed creation, he brought forth a host of subordinate beings called archons, a word that simply means rulers or authorities in Greek. And each of these archons was assigned to one of the 7 planetary spheres that ancient astronomers believed encircled the Earth. And together they formed a hierarchy of cosmic jailers whose primary purpose was to keep the material realm running according to their own designs. And the Gnostic texts describe these archons in vivid and unsettling detail, portraying them as beings who are sometimes ignorant and sometimes actively malevolent, on entities who govern the material world under the command of the demiurge and who work ceaselessly to prevent human souls from awakening to their true nature. For here is the great secret that the archons wish to keep hidden, the knowledge that the early church found so threatening that they burned every Gnostic text they could find. And that secret is this, that within each human being there exists a divine spark, a fragment of the true light from the pleroma that somehow became trapped within these bodies of flesh, these tombs of matter constructed by the archons. And this spark is not native to the material realm. It does not belong to the demiurge or his minions. It is a piece of the infinite divine that yearns to return to its source, and the entire apparatus of the material world with all its pleasures and pains, its distractions and desires, its systems of religion and government and social order, all of it serves one purpose from the Gnostic perspective, and that purpose is to keep the divine spark asleep, to prevent it from remembering its true origin, to bind the soul in cycles of forgetfulness so profound that it believes itself to be nothing more than a body destined for death. And the archons maintain this prison through several interlocking mechanisms. First, by enforcing forgetfulness so that each soul that enters the material realm has its memory of the divine source clouded over like a mirror covered in dust. Second, by creating false religions and laws that parody the true divine order, systems that demand obedience and worship directed toward the demiurge rather than the authentic God beyond all gods. And third, and perhaps most significantly, by binding souls to the wheel of reincarnation. For in the Gnostic view, death is not an escape, but merely a transition from one cell to another within the same prison. And when the soul attempts to ascend after the death of the body, when it tries to rise through the planetary spheres toward its true home in the pleroma, it encounters at each level the archon of that sphere, who acts as a toll collector, a guardian of the gate, who demands that the soul account for itself, and without the proper knowledge, without gnosis, the soul cannot pass. And so it is turned back, recycled, sent once more into the world of matter to inhabit another body and live another life of forgetting. And there is an even darker dimension to this system that the Gnostic texts hint at, though they do not always state explicitly. And this concerns what the archons actually gain from their administration of this cosmic prison. For they are described as beings who bind humanity to the stars, who ensure that human lives are dictated by material concerns rather than spiritual liberation. And they are said to be the source of the base human passions, the impulses of lust and greed and anger and fear that so often dominate human behavior. And when humans indulge these passions, when they are swept away by jealousy or consumed by hatred or paralyzed by terror, something happens at a level beyond ordinary perception, something the texts describe as feeding the archons. For these beings seem to derive sustenance from human emotional turmoil. They are nourished by the energy released when souls suffer and struggle and rage against their circumstances. And this transforms the entire picture from a mere prison into something far more troubling, into what can only be described as a harvest system, a cosmic farm where human beings are the crop and human suffering is the yield. And the walls of this prison are not made of stone or iron, but of something far more difficult to escape. They are made of forgetfulness and distraction, and the endless cycling of desire and disappointment, pleasure and pain, hope and despair that characterizes human existence. And the Gnostics, who wrote these texts 1600 years ago, believed they were passing on a warning and a map, a guide for the soul to navigate the spheres after death, passwords and recognitions that would allow the divine spark to finally break free of the Archon's grasp and return to the pleroma, to the fullness of being from which it had so long been exiled. And this is what the early church found so intolerable. Not merely the theological inversion of declaring the Creator God to be a blind impostor, but the entire framework that positioned established religion as part of the prison rather than the path to salvation. For if the Gnostics were right, then every altar and every priest and every ritual of the Orthodox faith was simply another bar in the cage, another mechanism for keeping the divine spark asleep and the harvest flowing. And so the texts were gathered and burned, the communities were scattered, the teachings were driven underground, and for 16 centuries, this alternative vision of human existence remained buried in the Egyptian sand, waiting like a time capsule for the moment when Muhammad Ali al-Saman would swing his mattock into that clay jar and release these dangerous words back into the world. In the quiet hours of the 20th century, far removed from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer and the buried codices of Egypt, a man named Robert Monroe began experiencing something that would reshape his understanding of reality itself. Monroe was not a mystic or a philosopher by training, but rather a successful American radio broadcasting executive, a man of commerce and technology who built his career on the solid ground of measurable signals and profitable enterprises. Yet beginning in 1958, Monroe found himself spontaneously leaving his physical body, adrifting into realms that seemed as real as the waking world, but operated according to entirely different laws. Rather than dismiss these experiences as hallucinations or retreat into denial, Monroe approached them with the methodical curiosity of an engineer, documenting everything, testing hypotheses, and eventually founding the Monroe Institute in Virginia to study consciousness using scientific instruments and controlled experiments. His 1971 book, Journeys Out of the Body, introduced the term out-of-body experience to the popular lexicon. But it was his later work, Far Journeys, that contained the revelation that would echo the ancient warnings we have been exploring tonight. During one of his journeys beyond the physical, Monroe encountered what he described as an information stream, a vast download of knowledge about the nature of Earth and humanity's place within it. And what he learned there was deeply disturbing. According to this transmission, Earth was not merely a planet that happened to develop life through random cosmic processes, but rather a carefully designed garden, an engineered ecosystem with a very specific purpose. And that purpose was the production and harvesting of a particular type of energy that Monroe came to call loosh. This loosh, Monroe explained, is generated by living beings when they experience intense emotions, particularly the darker spectrum of feeling, including fear, grief, suffering, despair, rage, and the desperate struggle for survival. The revelation continued with chilling specificity, explaining that animals were intentionally positioned on this planet to feed upon plants and upon each other, creating an endless cascade of predator and prey interactions, each struggle releasing the precious life force energy from the victims so it could be harvested by beings existing in dimensions beyond our ordinary perception. Consider the implications as Monroe presented them. that the fangs of the predator and the terror of the prey are not accidents of evolution, but deliberate design features, that claws and venom and the capacity for speed were installed specifically to prolong the combat between hunter and hunted, thereby producing greater quantities of loosh. Because the greater the suffering, the more life force is released, and the more satisfying the harvest for those Monroe called the cosmic energy farmers. In this framework, Earth is not a prison exactly, nor a school for souls as some spiritual traditions suggest, nor even a hell of punishment, but something perhaps more troubling still, a production environment, a garden cultivated across millennia for the explicit purpose of growing and harvesting emotional energy from its inhabitants. And if animals serve as loosh producers through their cycles of hunting and being hunted, their brief lives of fear and struggle, then humans represent something even more valuable. Crops capable of generating not just survival terror, but the entire sophisticated spectrum of human emotion, the exquisite suffering of heartbreak and betrayal, the slow agony of grief and loss, the corrosive weight of anxiety and depression, the sharp burst of trauma, and the lingering ache of regret. Monroe suggested that human beings, with our complex emotional lives and our capacity for extended psychological suffering across years and decades, produce a particularly refined grade of loosh, and that this may explain why human consciousness is kept in a state of forgetting, recycled again and again through what we call reincarnation, never quite remembering enough to see the larger pattern, never quite free enough to escape the harvest. This brings us to the concept that researchers and esoteric philosophers have come to call the reincarnation trap, a framework that synthesizes the ancient Gnostic warnings about archons, with modern accounts from near-death experiences and past life regression hypnosis. According to this perspective, the moment of death, which most spiritual traditions present as a liberation or homecoming, may actually be the most critical juncture in the cycle of cosmic harvesting, the point where the mechanism of entrapment operates most effectively. Proponents of this theory suggest that when consciousness separates from the physical body at death, it enters an intermediate state where it is vulnerable to manipulation by the very beings the Gnostics called archons, and that these beings have developed sophisticated techniques for ensuring that souls return to physical incarnation rather than escaping to their true home in the higher spiritual realms. The tunnel of light, that famous feature of near-death experiences reported consistently across cultures, is reframed in this view not as the welcoming radiance of heaven or the embrace of divine love, but as a mechanism of capture, a kind of cosmic flypaper that draws disoriented souls toward their next entrapment. Even more disturbing, proponents suggest that the loving figures who appear to greet the dying, the deceased relatives and benevolent beings of light who seem to offer comfort and guidance, may not be what they appear, may in fact be projections or impersonations designed to establish trust and lower defenses at the crucial moment when the soul might otherwise recognize its freedom. Once drawn into this intermediate realm, the soul is said to undergo a process that resembles nothing so much as a kind of spiritual contract negotiation, where it is shown its previous life, reminded of accumulated karma and unfinished business, presented with compelling reasons why it must return to physical existence to learn lessons, balance debts, or complete missions. These soul contracts, as they are called, are viewed by proponents of this theory not as genuine opportunities for growth, but as manipulations, agreements signed under duress or deception that bind the soul to yet another cycle of physical existence, another lifetime of emotional experience, another harvest of loosh for the unseen farmers. The concept of karma itself, so central to Eastern spiritual traditions and now widely accepted in Western alternative spirituality, takes on a darker cast in this interpretation, appearing not as a neutral cosmic law of cause and effect, but as a weaponized system of control, a ledger that can never quite be balanced, ensuring that every soul carries forward enough unresolved debt to require another return, another life, another contribution to the harvest. And underlying all of this, enabling the entire system to function smoothly, is the phenomenon of memory erasure, the mysterious veil of forgetting that descends upon consciousness at each new birth, wiping clean the accumulated wisdom of previous lifetimes, preventing souls from recognizing the pattern they are caught within, keeping each human life fresh with naive hope and unprepared for the manipulations that await at its end. Whether you encounter these ideas as disturbing possibilities, fascinating metaphors, or dangerous distractions from genuine spiritual truth, they carry within them echoes of what the Gnostics wrote nearly 2,000 years ago, that this world is not our true home, that powerful forces work to keep us here, and that liberation requires a special kind of knowledge, a gnosis, a seeing through of the apparent reality to what lies beneath and beyond. The question that hovers over all these speculations, from the clay tablets of Sumer to the trance journeys of a Virginia businessman, is not necessarily whether they are literally true in every detail, but what they might reveal about a persistent human intuition, an ancient suspicion that has surfaced again and again across cultures and centuries, that something about our existence here is not quite what it seems, that we are caught in something we did not choose, and that somewhere beyond the veil of forgetting, our true nature waits to be remembered, far across the roof of the world, where snow-capped peaks pierce the eternal blue, and prayer flags flutter their mantras into the thin mountain air. The Buddhist masters of Tibet developed their own profound cartography of the spaces between lives, and in doing so, they created perhaps the most detailed navigation manual ever devised for the journey of consciousness after the body falls away. A text so remarkably parallel to the Gnostic warnings that one must pause and wonder how two traditions separated by thousands of miles and vastly different cultural contexts could arrive at such strikingly similar conclusions about the nature of death and the traps that await the unprepared soul. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol, known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes the bardos as intermediate states, transitional zones, where consciousness passes through a series of encounters and challenges during the 49 days between one life and the next. And within these teachings, we find the same essential warning that echoed through Gnostic caves and was pressed into Sumerian clay. The warning that the soul after death will face beings and visions designed to confuse and redirect it back into the cycle of material existence rather than allowing it to pass beyond into liberation. In the first bardo, the moment of death itself, the consciousness encounters what the Tibetans call the clear light, and this clear light is described as reality itself, the pure, luminous nature of mind unconditioned by form or thought, the very essence from which all creation springs. And in this moment, the soul has its greatest opportunity for liberation, Because if it can recognize this light as its own true nature, rather than something foreign or frightening, it can merge with it completely and escape the wheel of rebirth forever. But the tragedy that the lamas describe again and again is that most souls do not recognize the clear light because they have spent their entire lives identifying with the body and the personality and the endless stream of desires and fears. And so, when confronted with the naked radiance of pure being, they shrink back in confusion, and the moment passes. Into the second bardo, the consciousness then descends, and here the visions begin in earnest. First, the peaceful deities appear as radiant forms of light, offering the soul another chance to recognize its own projections and awaken. But when these are not recognized as aspects of the self, they transform into the wrathful deities, terrifying apparitions with fangs and flames, and countless arms wielding weapons of destruction, and the unprepared consciousness flees in terror, not understanding that these horrifying forms are nothing more than its own unresolved energies and karma projected outward into the void. And this is where the parallel to the archons becomes impossible to ignore. For just as the Gnostics warned that soul would encounter hostile forces seeking to prevent its ascent through the planetary spheres, so too do the Tibetan teachings describe a gauntlet of bewildering experiences designed to keep the consciousness spinning in confusion until it stumbles back into a womb and takes on flesh once again. The lamas teach that recognition is everything, that the soul, which has been trained during life to understand the illusory nature of all phenomena, can pass through these visions unaffected, seeing them for what they truly are. But the soul which remained asleep during its embodiment, which never questioned the nature of reality or developed the awareness to recognize its own projections, will be swept along helplessly by the karmic winds until it finds itself once again crying in an infant body with no memory of where it has been or what opportunities it has missed. And generation after generation the cycle continues, an endless harvest of souls who almost made it to freedom before being shepherded back into the garden. When Walter Evans Wentz first translated this text into English in 1927, he gave it the title The Tibetan Book of the Dead, specifically because he recognized the striking parallels with the ancient Egyptian funerary texts. For the Egyptians too had developed an elaborate system of afterlife navigation, complete with maps of the underworld regions and instructions for passing through judgment. And in the famous weighing of the heart ceremony depicted on countless papyrus scrolls, we see the same underlying concept that the soul after death must prove itself worthy of continuing to higher realms rather than being consumed or sent back to wander in shadows. The Egyptian Book of Coming Forth by Day, as it was actually called in the original language, provided the deceased with spells and declarations and divine names to speak at crucial moments, nay, passwords that would allow passage past the guardians of each realm. And how remarkable it is that this concept of needing specific knowledge to navigate past hostile gatekeepers appears independently in the Nag Hammadi texts, where the Gnostics describe the archons demanding that ascending souls prove their right to pass, and in the Tibetan traditions where recognition serves as the key that unlocks each barrier, and in the Sumerian descents to the underworld, where Inanna must pass through 7 gates, surrendering something at each one. We are confronted with a choice when we encounter these parallels. Either we accept the conventional explanation that humans throughout history have simply invented comforting stories about death and coincidentally arrived at similar narrative structures through universal psychological processes. Or we allow ourselves to consider the unsettling possibility that these traditions are all describing the same underlying reality from different cultural vantage points. That when the body dies, there truly is a journey to be undertaken, and forces to be navigated, and a choice to be made between liberation and return. And that across millennia, the clearest seers of every civilization have glimpsed this territory and tried to leave us maps. What makes this synthesis even more compelling is how naturally these ancient frameworks translate into our contemporary metaphors. For in an age of computers and simulations, we have developed our own vocabulary for describing reality as something constructed and potentially illusory. And the Gnostic vision of archons, maintaining a false world under a deluded creator, God maps with eerie precision onto our modern conception of simulated realities, run by programmers who may not even know they are themselves part of a larger simulation. The Matrix films, which captivated global audiences at the turn of the millennium, were explicitly drawing on Gnostic sources, presenting a story of humanity enslaved within a generated dream, harvested for their energy by machine overlords who keep them docile with manufactured experiences. And the hero of that story achieves liberation, not through physical force, but through gnosis, through the direct recognition that the prison is an illusion, through waking up. And audiences around the world responded to this ancient message dressed in leather and sunglasses, because somewhere beneath their conscious awareness, they sensed that it was touching on something real, something they had always suspected but could never quite articulate. Perhaps this is why these ideas keep returning in each generation, why the Gnostic impulse can never be fully suppressed no matter how many libraries are burned or how many heretics are silenced, because the deepest intuitions of the human soul sense that something is not quite right with this reality, that we are more than we have been told we are, that the authorities who claim to know the truth about existence may themselves be deceived, or may be actively participating in a deception. And whenever a voice arises to articulate this suspicion clearly, it finds an immediate resonance in hearts that have been waiting without knowing what they were waiting for. The simulation theorists in their universities, the conspiracy researchers in their internet forums, the spiritual seekers in their meditation centers, the shamans in their jungle ceremonies, all of them are circling the same profound question that the Sumerians pressed into wet clay and the Gnostics sealed in desert jars, and the Tibetan masters whispered to their dying disciples in mountain monasteries. The question of what this reality truly is, and what role we play within it, and whether there is a door out, and what might be waiting on the other side. And as you rest now in the darkness listening to these words, you join a lineage of questioners stretching back to the very beginning of human consciousness. Seekers who refused to accept the world at face value and dared to imagine that freedom might be possible. And whatever you believe about archons or bardos or simulations, that spark of questioning is itself the most precious thing you possess. The one thing that cannot be harvested because it is the essence of sovereignty itself. The light of awareness that recognizes it is aware. And so we arrive at the heart of what the ancients desperately wished for us to understand. The knowledge they encoded in scrolls and pressed into clay and whispered in secret gatherings by candlelight. the gnosis that could set a soul free from the endless turning of the wheel. The Gnostics divided humanity into three essential types, not as judgment, but as observation of spiritual readiness. There were the Hilic souls, those so deeply immersed in matter that they identified completely with their physical existence, their appetites, their possessions, their fleeting pleasures, unaware that anything existed beyond the veil of the material. Then came the psychic souls, those who sensed something greater, who followed religious laws and moral codes, who believed in higher powers but still operated within the system the archons had designed, still sought salvation through the very structures meant to contain them. And finally, there were the pneumatic souls, the spiritual ones, those rare beings who had awakened to the spark of divine light burning within their own hearts, who recognized that they were not of this world, but merely passing through it, prisoners who had remembered they were once free. For these awakened ones, the Gnostics offered not belief, but direct experiential knowledge, not faith in doctrines, but the living flame of gnosis itself, a knowing that required no intermediary, no priest, no institution, only the courage to see what had always been there. In this radical vision, the figure of Christ takes on an entirely different meaning than what the Orthodox churches would later teach. He was not a sacrifice offered to appease an angry God, not a blood payment for inherited sin, but something far more extraordinary, a divine messenger sent from the true God beyond all gods, a liberator who descended into the Archon's prison wearing the disguise of flesh. He came as a cosmic trickster, outwitting the rulers of this realm who could not perceive his true nature, slipping past their defenses like light through a crack in a prison wall. His mission was not to establish a new religion with its own hierarchies and control systems, but to teach humanity the gnosis required for liberation, to reveal the passwords and recognition formulas that would allow the awakened soul to pass through the celestial spheres unmolested, to give us the keys that the jailers had hidden. These passwords were not mere words, but states of recognition, declarations of spiritual sovereignty that the archons had no power to deny. When challenged at the gates between worlds, the ascending soul would speak its truth. I am a child of the Pleroma. I do not belong to you or your world. I am merely passing through your realm on my way home to the light that existed before your master was born. And here we discover the most beautiful secret of all, the reason why the harvest system, for all its apparent power, contains within it the seeds of its own limitation. There are frequencies of consciousness that cannot be harvested, energies so refined and so aligned with the original divine source that they dissolve the very structures designed to contain them. Love, not the desperate clinging love born of fear and need, but the unconditional radiance that asks nothing in return and gives without measure. Beauty, not the calculated attractiveness that provokes desire, but the selfless recognition of perfection that connects us to the eternal. Sovereign creation, the act of bringing forth new forms from the infinite wellspring within, participating in the original creative impulse that brought all things into being. These frequencies create feedback loops that destabilize the machines of control, that cause the harvesting apparatus to malfunction, that open doorways where before there were only walls. Robert Monroe, in his Journeys Beyond the Body, came to understand that simple awareness itself reduces the energy leakage that feeds the system, that consciousness properly directed dissolves the harvesting effect like sunlight burning away morning fog. The path of liberation is therefore not a path of fighting against the darkness, but of becoming so filled with light that the darkness simply cannot maintain its hold upon you. It begins with remembering, with the slow and sometimes painful process of recovering what was deliberately erased, the knowledge of who you truly are and where you truly come from. Every moment of genuine presence, every act of selfless compassion, every recognition of beauty that asks for nothing, every creative expression that flows from your deepest truth. These are not merely pleasant experiences, but actual steps toward freedom, actual dissolutions of the chains that bind you to the wheel of forgetting and return. You were never meant to be a crop in someone else's garden, never designed to be harvested, never created to serve as food for beings who forgot their own divine origin so long ago that they can no longer remember the light. You are a fragment of that original light, temporarily clothed in matter, temporarily forgetful of your nature, but never truly separate from the source that breathed you into existence. The Gnostics knew this. The Sumerians sensed it in their bones. Robert Monroe glimpsed it in his journeys. And now, in this quiet hour, as sleep beckons and the conscious mind prepares to release its grip, you too can begin to remember, can begin to feel the spark that no darkness can extinguish, can begin to know with a knowing beyond words that you have always been free, that the prison exists only as long as you believe in its walls, and that the moment of awakening is always now, always available, always waiting for you to simply turn toward it and say, yes, I remember, I am coming home. And so we arrive at the end of our journey together, though perhaps it is not truly an end, but merely a threshold, a pause between one breath and the next, between one state of being and another. We have traveled through millennia of human questioning, from the reed styluses pressing into wet Mesopotamian clay to the hidden jars buried in Egyptian sand, from the strange territories Robert Monroe mapped in the quiet of his Virginia laboratory to the ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries high among the clouds. Whether these texts speak literal truth about cosmic farmers and archonic rulers, or whether they encode in symbolic language something profound about the human condition, about the ways we forget ourselves and the ways we might remember, their message has echoed across every age and every civilization that has paused long enough to listen. You are more than a body moving through space and time. You are more than the stories you have been told about yourself, more than the roles you have been assigned, more than the fears and hungers and forgettings that seem to define the boundaries of your life. Within you burns something that the ancient Gnostics called a divine spark, something that no archon can extinguish, no demiurge can claim as its own, no harvest system, however vast or ancient, can truly contain. The Sumerians pressed their warnings into clay, knowing that clay endures when empires crumble. The Gnostics hid their gospels in sealed jars, knowing that truth, like water, finds its way through even the smallest cracks. Monroe spoke his discoveries into magnetic tape, trusting that somehow, someday, ears that needed to hear would hear. And now, in the quiet hours of this night, in whatever room you find yourself, in whatever circumstances have brought you to this moment, these ancient words find you as they have found seekers throughout all of human history, as they will continue to find those who come after you, long after your own journey through this strange and beautiful world is complete. The message they carry is remarkably simple beneath all the mythology and cosmology and speculation. Awareness is the key that unlocks every door. Consciousness itself, the simple fact of knowing that you know, is the one thing that cannot be harvested, cannot be fooled, cannot be trapped in any system, however elaborate. When you are aware that you are dreaming, the dream loses its power to frighten you. When you remember that you are more than any story, the story becomes a garment you wear rather than a prison that contains you. So let your eyes grow heavy now if they wish. Let the weight of your body settle into whatever surface supports you. Let the thoughts that have accompanied us through these hours begin to dissolve like morning mist over ancient rivers. You need not hold on to any of it, for what is truly yours cannot be lost, and what is not truly yours was never worth grasping. If there are indeed archons waiting at the boundaries between worlds, if there are indeed systems designed to recycle souls back into forgetfulness, then the greatest preparation you can make is simply this: to practice remembering, to cultivate the quiet awareness that watches thoughts arise and dissolve, to strengthen the knowing that exists beneath all the things you think you know. And in those final moments, whenever they come, whether you encounter tunnels of light or beings wearing familiar faces or vast systems beyond imagining, you will carry with you the one truth that matters. You have always been free. You are a child of the infinite, a spark of the light that existed before any demiurge fashioned any world, a consciousness that merely visits these realms of matter and time without ever truly belonging to them. The Gnostics knew this. The Sumerians knew this. Deep within yourself, in that place where knowing needs no proof and truth needs no argument, you have always known this too. You need only remember. So rest now, traveler. Let the night hold you gently. Let your dreams be doorways rather than walls. And when you wake, whether to another morning in this familiar world or to whatever lies beyond the veil of sleep and forgetting, may you wake remembering who you truly are. The spark within you is inextinguishable. The freedom within you is inalienable, and the love that underlies all things, that love which the ancient texts tell us the archons can never harvest because its frequency dissolves their very machinery, that love is your birthright and your home. Carry it with you always. Carry it beyond the boundaries of worlds. And know that no matter how convincing the dream becomes, no matter how solid the walls of any prison appear, you have always possessed the key. You have always been the key. Sleep well.